Two muffled gunshots punched through the pre-dawn silence of Harlow General Hospital, and the blonde nurse standing at the nurses' station didn't even blink. She was already counting. 2 shooters, suppressed 9mm, 15 seconds between shots. Coordinated entry, not panic fire. She set down her clipboard, pressed one hand flat against the counter, and exhaled slowly through her nose while every other person on the floor froze in confusion. The armed security guard at the elevator, 6'2", 240 pounds, stepped instinctively to the side when she walked past him. He didn't know why. His body just did it. Before we go any further, if you've never been to this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell here don't hold back. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the end, because what happens in this hospital is something you will not see coming. The morning shift at Harlow General Hospital in Caldwell Bay, North Carolina began the way it always did. Understaffed, overcaffeinated, and held together by people who hadn't slept enough. Nurses moved in tight clusters around the station on floor 3, passing charts back and forth with the mechanical efficiency of people who had learned to function on 4 hours of rest and bad vending machine coffee. The fluorescent overhead lights gave everyone the same gray-green pallor regardless of how healthy they actually were, and the hallways smelled like antiseptic and something faintly sweet underneath it that nobody ever tried to identify. Nurse Avery Sinclair had been on shift since 11 the night before. She didn't look tired. That was the thing people noticed. Not that she was particularly striking, though she was, with pale blue eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a clip that was never quite tight enough, but that she didn't carry herself the way someone should after 9 hours on a trauma floor. She moved through the hallway with an economy of motion that was hard to name. Not graceful exactly, more like deliberate, like someone who had learned a long time ago that wasted movement was a liability. Dr. Preston Hale noticed her the way he noticed most things he found irritating, with immediate, reflexive disdain. Sinclair. He said her name without looking up from the tablet in his hand. The patient in Bay 6 is asking about her medication schedule again. I don't need her bothering the attending. Handle it. Avery looked at him for a moment. I already talked to her twice tonight. She's asking because nobody told her there was a dosage change. If someone had updated the chart, I don't need commentary. He finally looked up. The look on his face was the particular brand of dismissal that senior physicians at this hospital wore like a uniform. You're a floor nurse. You manage patients. I manage medicine. Do your job. She nodded once and walked away. Not because she agreed with him, not because she was going to let it go, but because there were 22 other patients on this floor, and arguing with Preston Hale in the middle of a hallway at 4 in the morning was the least efficient use of the next 5 minutes she could imagine. In Bay 6, Mrs. Delphine Okafor, 63, recovering from a hip replacement, with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, looked up when Avery pushed through the curtain. Finally, she said, nobody told me they changed my blood thinner. I could feel it. Something was different. You were right, Avery said, pulling the stool close and sitting down so they were at the same eye level. That was something she always did. Patients didn't need someone standing over them. They adjusted the dosage this afternoon. It should have been communicated to you and it wasn't. I'm sorry about that. You're the only one who actually talks to me like I'm a person. You are a person. Avery picked up her wrist lightly to check her pulse, not because the monitors weren't doing it already, but because human contact meant something. Everything looks good. Your levels are exactly where they should be. Try to get some sleep. Mrs. Okafor studied her face. You look like you're carrying something heavy, sweetheart. I'm fine. That's what people say when they're not fine. Avery smiled. It was a real smile, not a professional one, slightly crooked, hitting the left side of her face more than the right. Get some sleep, Mrs. Okafor. She was halfway back to the nurse's station when her radio crackled. Not the standard hospital channel. A different frequency, one that technically shouldn't have been bleeding into the hospital's internal communication system at all. She caught 3 words before the signal cut. Perimeter confirmed, entering. She stopped walking. Around her, the floor continued its normal rhythm. A monitor beeped somewhere. One of the overnight nursing assistants laughed at something on her phone. The elevator at the end of the hall dinged and opened to an empty car. Avery stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then she walked to the window at the end of the corridor and looked down at the parking structure across the street. Fourth level. She counted the vehicles. A white panel van that hadn't been there when she'd arrived for her shift. Its rear doors were closed, but the vehicle was sitting slightly low on its axles. Weight in the back. She turned and walked back to the station. "Hey!" She leaned over the counter toward Nurse Brody Callahan, who was 3 years out of nursing school and still surprised every time something went wrong. "When did security say the VIP floor was going active?" Brody looked up. "What VIP floor?" "Sixth floor. They locked it down about 2 hours ago." "Nobody told me anything about that." He frowned. "Why would they lock down 6? She didn't answer. She picked up this house phone and dialed the security desk on the ground floor. It rang 7 times before someone picked up and said, "Yeah." "This is Sinclair on 3. I need a status check on the 6th floor lockdown." A pause. "There's no lockdown on 6. She set the phone down carefully. There was no lockdown on 6, which meant the security badge she'd seen used on the 6th floor elevator, the one she'd noticed because the officer who used it was wearing his holster on the wrong side, wasn't a legitimate hospital security officer. Someone had gotten into the building before the day shift and positioned themselves upstairs. She thought about the frequency bleed on her radio. She thought about the white van sitting low on its axles. She thought about the 2 suppressed shots she'd heard from the east stairwell 14 minutes ago. That every other person on this floor had already convinced themselves was a backfire from outside. And she thought about the patient who had checked into room 612 last night, under a name that wasn't in any insurance database she could pull, which she'd pulled because the admission notes hadn't matched, and she'd noticed. General Walter Price. Retired. 5 decades of military service. 4 stars. The kind of man who walked into a room and made career military officers straighten involuntarily. He had been admitted for what the official record called a cardiac evaluation. He'd arrived with a small security detail that the hospital administration had accommodated with almost no questions, which told Avery the administration had been told to accommodate them and hadn't been told why. She looked at the clock above the nurse's station. 5:47 a.m. The day shift supervisor, Karen Feltz, would arrive at 6. The building's main security rotation changed at 6:15. There was a window, small, maybe 20 minutes, when the floors would be handled by whoever was already inside. Avery took the supply key from its hook behind the station, walked to the medication storage room at the end of the hall, and let herself in. She didn't take anything. She just stood in the middle of the room for a moment, looking at what was there. Gauze, tubing, adhesive pads, sealed instrument trays, oxygen tanks, portable crash cart pushed against the back wall. Her eyes moved across everything slowly and carefully, the way her eyes always moved across a space the first time she thought she might need to use it. Old habit. She'd spent a long time trying to unlearn old habits. She stepped back out and locked the door. The problem with working emergency medicine, the specific bone-deep problem that nobody really told you about in nursing school, was that it rewired the way your brain processed threat. Most people experienced fear as a sudden, full-body alarm. Heart rate spiking, tunnel vision, the urge to either run or stand completely still. Avery's body didn't do that anymore. Fear had been trained out of her threat response a long time ago, replaced by something colder and more useful. A rapid, almost mechanical assessment of what was happening, what was likely to happen next, and what resources were available to shape that outcome. She didn't think of this as a gift. It wasn't. It was damage that had proven itself to be occasionally practical. She'd been a combat medic before she was a hospital nurse. She'd been more than that, technically, though she hadn't described herself that way to anyone at Harlow General or in Caldwell Bay or anywhere in the 2 years since she'd separated from the service and driven north along the coast, until she found a place where she didn't know anyone and no one knew her. She'd taken the nursing position because she was good at it and because staying still helped. She'd told herself she was done with the other thing. She almost believed it some mornings. This was not going to be one of those mornings. She was back at the nurse's station when the elevator doors at the end of the hall opened and a man she didn't recognize stepped out. I was wearing scrubs, green, which was surgical, which meant he had no business being on the medical surgical floor at this hour. And he was carrying a tablet like he belonged there. His eyes moved across the floor in a specific way. Not the way someone looks when they're lost, the way someone looks when they're counting heads. Avery turned back to her computer screen. In her peripheral vision, she watched him pause at the corridor junction, appear to read something on the tablet, and then move toward the east stairwell. The same stairwell the suppressed shots had come from 40 minutes ago. She picked up the house phone again and called the security desk. Yeah. I need you to physically check the east stairwell on floor 3 and get back to me. Ma'am, I need you to do it now. A longer pause this time. I'll send someone. She knew nobody was coming. The tone of his voice had the particular flatness of someone who had already been told what to do and what not to do by someone else this morning. She set the phone down again. Brody was looking at her from across the station. Everything okay? Fine. She picked up 2 charts and made herself walk at a normal pace toward the first patient room on her left. Inside, she spent 4 minutes checking vitals, adjusting the drip rate on an IV, and helping a 40-year-old man named Harold reposition his pillows because he'd been lying on his left side too long and his hip was starting to ache. You're good at this, Harold said. My last nurse kind of just... He made a vague gesture that apparently represented indifference. Try to keep your weight off that side, she said. You hear anything weird earlier? Like a couple pops? Probably a car outside. Yeah, Harold said. That's what I figured. She kept her face completely neutral. She was doing math in her head while she smoothed his blanket and double-checked the call button was within reach. 2 shooters, based on the acoustic signature of the shots and the interval between them. Sequential rather than simultaneous, suggesting they'd taken separate positions rather than moving together. The man in the surgical scrubs was a third, which meant at minimum a 3-person entry team, possibly more who hadn't been visible yet. The 6th floor had General Price and his security detail. A proper detail would be 3 to 5 personnel at this hour, depending on their rotation. But she'd seen the way they'd come in last night, relaxed, professional, but comfortable, not running a threat assessment on the building because they'd been told it was a routine evaluation at a civilian hospital. They wouldn't be expecting it. She left Harold's room and walked back to the station. One of the on-call doctors, a young resident named Marcus Webb, was leaning against the counter looking exhausted and scrolling through something on his phone. He was 28 and still had the habit of running one hand through his hair when he was stressed, which meant he'd been doing it for the last 3 hours based on how it looked. Webb, she said quietly, without making it obvious, don't look around. How many people are on this floor right now that you don't recognize? He blinked at her. What? New faces. People you haven't seen before tonight. He started to look around. Don't, she said. He stopped. Something in her voice made him stop. There was a guy in green scrubs. I thought he was from surgery. He's not. Marcus stared at her. He had the look of someone who was trying to figure out if this was some kind of test. What are you saying? I need you to get every patient on this floor into their rooms, doors closed. She kept her voice completely even. Don't use the PA system. Go room to room. Tell them it's a precaution. Don't tell them what kind. Avery, what is happening? She looked at him directly for the first time in this conversation. I'm going to need you to trust me for about the next 40 minutes. Can you do that? He was quiet for a second, then, yeah, okay. Go. He went. She watched him move down the hall and then turned back to the computer. She pulled up the hospital's internal phone directory and found the extension for the 6th floor nurses' station. She dialed it. It rang twice. A woman answered, steady voice, clipped, not a nurse. Yes. This is Sinclair on 3, Avery said. I need you to pass a message to whoever is running the security detail up there. A pause. Who is this? Tell them the building is already compromised. East stairwell and at minimum 1 planted operative on floor 3. They need to move him to an interior room now, not when they decide to. Now. Silence. Who are you? The woman said again, differently this time. Someone who's been listening to frequencies she shouldn't have access to and counting vans in the parking structure for the last hour. Avery kept her voice flat. Do you want to argue about my credentials, or do you want to move your principal? The line went quiet for 3 seconds. Then, hold. She held. Somewhere above her, 6th floor, directly overhead, she heard the soft, controlled sound of furniture being moved. They were listening. She heard Marcus's voice down the hall, calm and unhurried, telling a patient there was a routine precautionary procedure and asking her to stay in her room with the door closed. He was good at this. She hadn't known that about him until right now. The woman came back on the line. He wants to talk to you. Tell him, he says he wants to talk to you directly. He says he thinks he knows who you are. Avery stood very still. Tell him I'm busy, she said. She hung up. 3 minutes later, the power to floor 3 went out. Not a building-wide failure, just the floor. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, dropping everything into dim amber. Monitors switched to battery. The IV pumps continued their soft mechanical rhythm, unchanged. In the sudden quiet that followed the electrical hum cutting out, Avery heard something she'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. The east stairwell door at the end of the hall opened. Not a hospital sound, not the casual push of someone coming off the stairs at the end of a long walk-up. A precise, controlled entry. Someone who opened doors the way trained people open doors, low and quick, checking angles before crossing the threshold. 3 people came through. They were dressed in hospital maintenance uniforms. They were carrying equipment cases. And the way they held those cases, balanced differently from how you hold tools, weighted toward the bottom, told Avery everything she needed to know about what was actually inside them. At the far end of the hall, Brody Callahan stepped out of a patient room and looked straight at them. Hey, he said, the way you say hey to people you're mildly puzzled by. Can I help you guys? The one in front looked at him. Avery was already moving. She came around the nurse's station corner in the amber half-light, put herself directly between Brody and the 3 men, and said very calmly, Brody, go check on Mrs. Okafor. She's fine, go check on Mrs. Okafor. He heard something in her voice, the same thing Marcus had heard. He went. The man in front shifted his attention from where Brody had been to Avery. He was approximately 35. Well-built. Eyes that moved in a pattern she recognized, not looking at her face, looking at her hands, her stance, the distance between them. He'd been trained. Step aside, nurse, he said. He said it the way people said it when they expected it to work. I don't think that's going to happen, Avery said. He took 1 step toward her. She was calculating distance, the width of the corridor, the position of the other 2 behind him, the crash cart 14 feet to her left, and the oxygen tank mounted to the wall at the junction 8 feet to her right, all of it simultaneously, almost without trying, when her radio crackled again. This time it was clear. No bleed, no static. A direct transmission on a channel that should have been encrypted and wasn't, because someone on the other end had decided she needed to hear it. A man's voice, low, carrying the particular weight of someone who had spent decades having rooms go quiet when he spoke. Sinclair. She didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the man in front of her. Stand down. We're coming to you. The man in the maintenance uniform heard it too. His eyes shifted, just barely, just for half a second, toward the stairwell door at the far end. That half second was the first mistake he'd made. Avery looked at him steadily in the amber emergency light, with 22 patients behind closed doors and a resident counting on her trust, and the general's voice still warm on the radio frequency, and she thought about the fact that she had spent 2 years trying very hard to be done with this kind of morning. She reached up slowly and clicked the radio off. Here's what's going to happen, she said, and her voice was completely level, completely quiet, the way it got when she stopped trying to manage a situation and started simply being the most dangerous thing in it. You're going to tell your people in the east stairwell to stop moving, and then you and I are going to have a very short conversation about how the next few minutes go. The man in front of her studied her face. Something in his expression shifted. Not fear. Not quite. More like the particular recalibration of someone who has just walked into a room and realized it is not the room they thought it was. Who are you? He said. From the floor above them, something heavy hit the ground. And then the shooting started. The shooting started on the 6th floor, and the sound of it came down through the ceiling like something structural had given way. Not the crack of open fire, but the compressed, purposeful bark of weapons being used by people who knew how to use them, punctuated by the heavier return fire of whoever was up there fighting back. The man in the maintenance uniform made his decision in the same moment Avery made hers. He reached for the case. She didn't wait for him to open it. The corridor was narrow, maybe 8 feet across, and that was an advantage, not a problem. She closed the distance between them in 2 steps, got inside his reach before his hand had the case unlatched, and drove the heel of her palm into his chin with enough force to snap his head back into the wall behind him. He went down hard. The case hit the floor and skidded sideways. She was already turning toward the second man, who had been slower to react. Surprise, she thought distantly, is always the first casualty of a plan meeting reality. And she caught his outstretched arm at the wrist, used his own momentum to redirect him into the corridor wall, and put her forearm across the back of his neck with enough controlled pressure that he stopped moving. The third man ran, not toward her, back toward the stairwell door, which told her two things simultaneously. He wasn't the tactical lead, and he was going to tell someone what had just happened on floor 3. She let him go. She couldn't chase him and hold a corridor and protect 22 patients at the same time, and she was not going to make the mistake of prioritizing one problem while abandoning 3 others. The second man was conscious but disoriented, face against the baseboard, breathing in shallow pulls. She used the tubing from a supply cart that Brody had left in the hall. She'd talk to him about that later, if there was a later, and secured his wrists behind him with a knot her hands remembered without asking her brain for permission. The first man was out. She checked his pulse out of reflex because she was a nurse and checking pulses was apparently something she was going to keep doing regardless of the circumstances, and it was strong. She stood up. The overhead emergency lighting bathed the hall in amber. Somewhere behind her, a monitor beeped its patient rhythm, indifferent to everything. The sound from the 6th floor had gone quiet in the last 30 seconds, which was either very good or very bad, and she didn't know which yet. She picked up the equipment case the first man had dropped and opened it. Inside, 2 compact submachine guns, 4 loaded magazines, a small handheld radio, and a laminated floor plan of Harlow General Hospital with the 6th floor circled in red marker and 2 other locations marked in blue. One blue mark was on the loading dock, ground floor, east side. The other was on floor 3, current location. She stared at the floor plan for 3 seconds. Then she pocketed the handheld radio, left the weapons in the case, and pushed the case behind the nurse's station counter where it wouldn't be immediately visible. She was not going to pick up one of those weapons. Not because she couldn't use them. She could. And her hands were already telling her in the particular way that trained hands tell you things that she was holding back from something that felt almost like instinct. But she was in a hospital. She was surrounded by patients in beds, by glass partitions, by oxygen lines and IV bags, and people who could not move on their own. The math on firearms in this environment was bad, regardless of who was pulling the trigger. Marcus appeared at the end of the hall, moving fast and low the way people moved when they decided to trust someone and were committed to it. "I've got everyone behind closed doors," he said, slightly breathless. "What was that sound? The upstairs?" "Firefight on 6. He absorbed this. "The general. His detail is up there. They knew it was coming." She looked at him. "Is there any way to get a direct outside line? Not through the hospital switchboard." "The charge nurse office on this floor has a landline that goes direct. It's for administration overflow." She didn't know that. She should have known that. She filed the gap away for later, the way she filed things. Not with frustration, but with the cold notation of someone cataloging a mistake that couldn't be repeated. "Show me." He led her down the hall, past the closed patient doors, past the amber half-light pooling on the linoleum, and unlocked the charge nurse office with a key he had for reasons she didn't ask about. The office was small and smelled like stale coffee and someone's lunch from yesterday. The landline sat on the desk like something from a different decade. She picked it up, dial tone. She dialed from memory, a number she hadn't used in 2 years, that she'd told herself she would never use again, that she'd kept in her head anyway because old habits didn't die. They just waited. It rang twice. A man answered. "Operations. This is Sinclair, former designation 7 Kilo. I need an emergency routing." A pause. It was a short pause, 3, maybe 4 seconds. But it had a specific quality to it, the quality of someone cross-referencing something they weren't sure they were going to find. "Say again your designation." 7 Kilo, Avery Sinclair. I separated 14 months ago." She looked at the wall while she talked. "I have a compromised civilian hospital, an active assault team, and a 4-star general currently under fire on the 6th floor. I need someone who has jurisdiction to get a response unit moving right now." Another pause, longer. "Hold," the man said. She held. Marcus stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, watching her face the way people watched faces when they were trying to understand what they'd gotten themselves into. "You were military," he said. "Not a question." "For a long time. Is that the way you—" He gestured vaguely at the hallway outside, where two men were secured and unconscious, and the amber light kept making everything look like the end of something. "Yes." "Okay," he said. "Just that. Okay." She appreciated it more than she had words for. The line came back. Different voice this time, older, with the compressed authority of someone who had learned a long time ago that efficiency of speech was a form of respect. "Sinclair. This is Deputy Director Harmon, DHS Joint Operations. I'm told you have a situation." "Yes, sir." She described it in 30 seconds flat. "Asset on 6th floor, 3-man entry team confirmed on floor 3 with additional personnel in east stairwell, white panel van in the parking structure 4th level, floor plan with marked entry points recovered from first team, active exchange on 6 approximately 4 minutes ago, now gone quiet." She kept her voice level. She did not editorialize. When she finished, Harmon said, "How are you certain the van is operational support and not coincidental?" "Weight distribution. Rear axles sitting approximately 4 inches lower than a standard empty vehicle of that class. And it wasn't there when I arrived for my 11 p.m. shift." A brief silence. "What's your current status?" "I have 22 patients on floor 3 behind closed doors. 2 of the entry team are secured in the corridor. A third ran back through the stairwell. I have the floor plan and the team's radio." "You're a floor nurse," Harmon said, not dismissively, more like he was putting pieces together. "Tonight I am." He didn't respond to that. "We're moving assets. What's your estimate on the assault team's next action?" She'd been thinking about this since she'd opened the equipment case. They came in with a plan that included a diversion. The power on this floor was cut selectively, which means someone had building access or inside knowledge of the electrical system. The third man going back to the stairwell means they know phase 1 on this floor failed. They'll consolidate and push for 6. She paused. "Unless they have a secondary objective on this floor that wasn't neutralized yet." She thought about the 2 blue marks on the laminated floor plan. "Hold that thought," Harmon said. She heard him issuing rapid instructions to someone away from the line, voice dropping below audible. She used the seconds to study the floor plan she'd pulled from her pocket and spread on the charge nurse's desk. The blue mark on floor 3 was positioned over the east corridor. Not the nurse's station, not a patient room. The mark was directly over. She oriented the plan against her mental map of the floor, the medication storage room. The room she'd let herself into at 5:47 a.m. and stood in and looked at and locked on her way back out. She thought about what was in medication storage: gauze, tubing, IV supplies, oxygen tanks. And at the back of the room behind the crash cart, the hospital's secondary pharmacy cabinet. Controlled substances. The kind of pharmaceutical inventory that wouldn't be in the main dispensary because Harlow General stored backup supplies separately as a protocol she'd read in the onboarding materials 18 months ago and remembered the way she remembered everything. Not because she tried, but because her brain had been trained to absorb and retain the kind of information that might matter later. They weren't just here to kill the general, or they weren't only here for that. She came back on the line. "Harmon, does General Price have any connection to a narcotics trafficking investigation? DOD, DEA, anything active?" A longer silence than any of the previous ones. That information would be, "I need a yes or a no." He gave her 3 seconds of quiet. That was itself an answer. "There is an active joint task force investigation in which General Price is a cooperating witness. The details are, they're not just here to remove him," Avery said. "They want something from this hospital. Possibly pharmaceutical records, possibly physical product they arranged to have stored here through a compromised supply chain. I need the hospital administrator's emergency contact, whoever has the controlled substances inventory codes." "Sinclair, if they get into medication storage on this floor and there's something in that inventory that connects to their operation, they have 2 objectives accomplished in 1 facility visit. I need to know what I'm actually protecting here." Harmon said slowly, "I'll get you the administrator. Hold." She pulled the handheld radio from her pocket and turned it on. Static. Then a voice, terse, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, maybe, or possibly somewhere in the Balkans. "3 is cold. What's your status?" Someone from another part of the team trying to reach the men she'd put on the floor. She clicked the radio once, as if the signal was broken, and set it back down. Enough to suggest the channel was live, but compromised. By another few minutes before they confirmed what had happened. Marcus was still in the doorway. He'd been very quiet for the last several minutes, which she respected. "The medication storage room," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever they're after. It's in there, isn't it?" "Possibly." "I can go block the access door. There's a gurney storage alcove right next to it. I can—" "No." She said it immediately and without apology. "I need you mobile, not fixed. If this floor gets breached again while I'm trying to deal with whatever's happening on 6, you're the only person down here who can help the patients. That's your job right now. That's the most important job on this floor." She met his eyes. "Do you understand that?" He looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. "Yeah. Stay off the PA. If something happens and you need to move patients, take them toward the west corridor, away from the stairwell, bathrooms, utility closets, anything with a lockable door." He nodded. Harmon came back on the line. "I have the hospital CEO's emergency contact. I'm also telling you that response assets are 22 minutes out minimum, ground and air. You need to hold the building." 22 minutes was a long time. She'd held positions for longer. She didn't say that. "Patch me the CEO." While Harmon transferred the call, she turned the floor plan over and looked at the back. Blank. And used a pen from the desk to begin sketching the corridor layout of floor 3 from memory, marking where the secured men were, where the stairwell entry was, where medication storage sat relative to the 2 access points from the hall. Old habit. A visual of the space always helped. A woman's voice came on the line, rough with sleep, immediately alert in the way of someone used to early morning emergencies. "This is Harlow General CEO Pamela Ruiz." "Ms. Ruiz, my name is Avery Sinclair. I'm a floor nurse on 3 and I need your controlled substance access codes for the secondary pharmacy cabinet in medication storage." A silence that was different from the operational silences she'd been navigating for the last hour. This one had a particular texture, the texture of someone trying to reconcile what they were hearing with the reality they'd woken up 5 minutes ago prepared for. "I'm sorry, who? The hospital is under active assault. DHS has confirmed it and has units en route. There is a possibility that your secondary medication storage contains materials connected to a narcotics trafficking operation being run through your supply chain. I need to get into that room and verify the inventory before the assault team does." She kept her voice absolutely even. "I understand this is a lot to absorb at once. I need you to absorb it quickly." Another silence. Then, "How do I know you're who you say you are?" "You can call Deputy Director Harmon at DHS Joint Operations. He's expecting your call. I'm going to keep this line open while you do." She set the phone down on the desk, looked at Marcus and said, "I need the storage room key. It's at the nurse's station, on the hook behind—" "I know where it is." She'd taken it earlier. She pulled it from her scrub pocket. "I need you to stay by that phone. When the CEO comes back on, tell her yes, confirm whatever she asks, and get me the codes." "And what are you doing?" "I'm going to check the stairwell." Marcus stared at her. "That's where the 3rd man went." "I know. He might still be in there." "I know that too." He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't expect one. She left him with the phone and the floor plan and the amber light and walked back out into the corridor, past the 2 secured men on the floor. The second one had started to regain awareness and was testing the wrist restraint, methodically, the way a trained person tests a restraint rather than just pulling against it, and moved to the east stairwell door. She put her hand flat against it, felt nothing through the door, no vibration, no footstep rhythm. She stood to the side of the door frame, not in front of it, and pushed it open with one foot. The stairwell was dim, emergency lighting only, same as the hall, red-tinted rather than amber, giving everything the flat quality of a photograph from the wrong era. She listened for 4 full seconds before she moved. Clear. She went in and looked up. Between floor 3 and 4 on the landing, there was a smear on the railing. Not quite blood, darker than blood in this light, but she'd seen enough of both to know what she was looking at. The 3rd man was hurt. He'd gone up, not down. She looked at the stairwell walls. The hospital's electrical panel access for this section of the building was on floor 4. She'd read the fire safety documentation during onboarding because it was there, and she was someone who read fire safety documentation. which meant the person who had selectively cut the power to floor 3 had done it from up there, not from the basement as she'd first assumed, and had then moved to the stairwell and was now bleeding somewhere between her and the fourth-floor landing. She also noted standing in the stairwell and looking at the infrastructure with the particular attention she gave to spaces she was about to navigate. The air handling unit access panel on the wall to her left was slightly ajar. It shouldn't be. Those panels were sealed and alarmed. She crossed to it and opened it fully. Inside the access cavity, a backpack. Navy blue, military grade, with a hard case interior that had been custom fitted. She unzipped it. It took her approximately 8 seconds to understand what she was looking at. Not pharmaceutical product, not documents, a full breaching kit, shaped charges, a detonator, copper-lined cutting tools designed for vault-grade doors. The kind of equipment you used when you needed to get through something that a standard door charge wouldn't touch. Which meant there was something in this building behind something heavier than a standard door. She thought about the medication storage room and its standard push-lock cabinet. She thought about what kind of inventory would require a vault-grade door. She thought about the DHS call and the words Joint Task Force and Cooperating Witness, and the deliberate way Harmon had not told her everything she'd asked. There was something else in this hospital that she didn't know about. She re-zipped the backpack, left it where it was, and went back through the stairwell door into the amber corridor. The man she'd secured against the baseboard, the one who'd been testing the restraint, had gotten one hand partially free. He was lying still now, watching her with the flat professional assessment of someone who had reclassified the situation and was trying to figure out what approach would actually work. She crouched down next to him. "There's a breaching kit in the stairwell," she said. "Not for a door on this floor. What's behind the vault panel?" He looked at her without expression. "I know there's a vault panel somewhere in this building," she said. "The kit is specific. The cutting tools are specific. You don't bring that equipment for a medication cabinet." He said nothing. "I'm not law enforcement," she said. I'm not recording this. I'm a nurse who is trying to figure out whether there are explosives in my hospital, which is something I need to know right now." Something moved behind his eyes. A small recalibration. "Sub-basement," he said. "Evidence storage." She stood up. Sub-basement. Harlow General had a sub-basement level she'd never been to. It was listed in the building directory as maintenance and restricted access, and she'd had no reason to go there in 18 months of working the floor. She was walking back to the charge nurse office when Marcus appeared in the hall, moving fast. "The CEO came back on," he said. "She gave me the codes, and Sinclair—" He stopped. He had the particular expression of someone who was about to say something they knew was going to be hard to hear. "There's a problem." "What kind?" "She told me something about the building, about what was approved 4 months ago when the county brought in a federal contract." She waited. "There's an evidence cold storage unit in the sub-basement," Marcus said. "It was installed quietly. The staff weren't briefed on it. The county told the CEO it was standard overflow for the federal court system. Documents, biological samples, that kind of thing." He looked at her. "But she said about a month after it went in, she started getting requests from people she didn't recognize to adjust the building's security logs. Requests she thought were coming from the county." Avery looked at him for a long moment. "She ignored them," Marcus said. "She thought it was a bureaucratic mix-up. She never followed up." Avery turned and looked at the ceiling. The 6th floor directly above her, where the general, who was a cooperating witness in a joint task force investigation, was currently being protected by a security detail that had not known this building had a compromised administrative chain. She looked at Marcus. "How many people knew about the sub-basement unit?" She said 4 people in administration, and the company that installed it. He paused. She also said 2 of those 4 administrators resigned without explanation in the last 3 months. From the stairwell behind her, she heard something. Not a footstep, not a door, but the specific sound of a communication device transmitting. A click and a carrier tone, low and brief, the kind of signal check you ran before a coordinated action. They were repositioning. She had the storage key and the cabinet codes and a phone line to DHS and 20 minutes left on the response clock. And somewhere below her feet there was a federal evidence unit that someone in this building had been quietly compromising for months. And the man who knew enough to bring this operation to justice was 1 floor above her head. She turned toward the stairwell. "Marcus," she said without looking back. "Yeah." "Lock every door on this floor that has a lock. And stay away from the stairwell. She was already pushing through the door when he said her name again, quietly, with the kind of weight that wasn't a question. She stopped, hand on the door. Whatever they told you about yourself, he said, when you left. Whatever you decided you were or weren't anymore. She waited. I don't think it took, he said. She didn't answer him. She went through the door, into the red-lit stairwell, and started moving up. The stairwell smelled like concrete dust and something metallic that wasn't rust. She went up fast but not reckless. Right side of the stairs, away from the railing, minimizing her silhouette against the emergency lighting. The smear she'd seen on the landing between 3 and 4 was darker now up close. More of it, tracking up the next flight in uneven intervals. The third man was bleeding at a rate that said he'd caught something during the exchange on 6. Not a graze, a real hit, somewhere that was draining him, but slowly enough that he was still mobile. She followed the trail without touching it. On the landing between 4 and 5, she stopped. Above her, 2 floors up, she could hear voices. Not shooting, voices. That meant the firefight on 6 had ended and someone was in control of the space. She couldn't tell from here who had won it. She pressed herself against the wall and listened for 30 seconds, trying to pull something usable out of the muffled exchange, and got almost nothing. A tone more than words, and the tone was terse, clipped, the flat communication of people running a tactical situation, which could belong to either side. She kept going. Between 5 and 6 she found him. The third man from the corridor, the one who'd run, was sitting against the wall on the landing, left hand pressed hard into his right side. His face the gray-white color of someone whose blood pressure had been dropping for a while. The weapon that should have been in the equipment case was tucked under his right thigh. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved for a second. His hand went toward the weapon. She was faster. Not because of speed exactly, but because he had to move through pain, and she didn't. And she stepped on the barrel before he had a grip on it. "Don't," she said. He looked up at her. He was younger than she'd thought in the corridor, maybe 26, 27, with the compact build of someone who'd done serious physical training and the eyes of someone who was trying very hard not to show how badly he was hurt. "You need pressure on that," she said. He said nothing. "I'm a nurse. You're losing blood." She crouched down, not close enough to be grabbed, far enough to assess. "Gunshot?" A pause. "Ricochet." He said it the way you said things you didn't want to admit. "From 6?" He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at his hand against his side. The placement was right. Instinctive wound response, pressing at the source. But the angle of the injury from what she could see of the blood spread under his jacket suggested the fragment had entered laterally and angled down, which meant possible internal involvement, which meant he had probably 40 to 60 minutes before this became a situation that a pressure dressing couldn't manage. She pulled a compression wrap from her scrub pocket. She carried 2, always, because the floor taught you to carry what you needed before you needed it, and held it out. He stared at it. "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I need the exit on 6 to be covered, and I can't do that if the person sitting on this landing is bleeding out and going into shock in the next 20 minutes. Take it." He took it. His hands were steadier than they should have been. She watched him apply it, badly, the angle was wrong, and said, "Tighter on the lower edge," and he adjusted without arguing. "How many on 6?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm going up there regardless. If you want the person who might be in a position to tell the responding medics where you are, to actually know what she's walking into, answer the question." A long pause. The building hummed around them. 4 went up initially, he said. 2 of ours are down. Down meaning dead. He said it flatly, no inflection, which meant 2 of the assault team were dead on 6, and at least one of the general security detail had to be down too. Otherwise, the exchange would have been over faster. She did the math. 2 assault operatives, plus the man in front of her, plus at least 1 more unaccounted for, against a security detail that had started at 3 to 5 personnel. She didn't know how many were still functional on either side. "The general," she said. "Is he alive?" The man looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. "Your people got him into a room." She stood up. "Stay on this landing. Don't move toward the stairwell doors. If you move, the responding units will not know you're a non-combatant. They'll treat you as a threat. Do you understand?" "I'm not a non-combatant." You're incapacitated and unarmed and bleeding on a stairwell landing. As of right now, that's what you are." She looked down at him. "Who sent you?" He looked away. "Who's running the team?" Nothing. She picked up the weapon from under his leg. It was a compact 9mm, one round in the chamber, full magazine. She cleared the chamber, ejected the magazine, and set both pieces on the landing separately, out of his immediate reach, within reach of someone who wasn't hurt. Then she went up the last flight to 6. She stopped at the door. The light under it was different from the emergency amber, brighter, flickering slightly, which meant the 6th floor had its own independent power source, or the power cut hadn't reached this level, or both. She could hear movement now. Single person, from the sound, moving with the controlled caution of someone clearing a space rather than the efficiency of someone who owned it. She pushed the door open 3 inches and looked through the gap. The 6th floor was set up differently from 3. Fewer beds, more private rooms, a wider central corridor designed to accommodate the kind of medical equipment that came with high-value patients. The nurse's station in the center was empty, its monitors still running, several of them showing vitals feeds that were still active. The general was alive. At least one person up here was alive. 12 feet from the door, a man in black tactical clothing was moving along the wall with his weapon up, checking doorways. He was methodical, professional, moving away from her. She went through the door low and fast and covered the 12 feet before he reached the next doorway, and she hit him from behind with the combined force of her momentum and the heel of her forearm across the base of his skull. Not the clean theater of a knockout blow, but the real version, which required more force than people expected and left her wrist aching. And he went forward into the wall and then down, and she caught his weapon on the way and had it in her hands before he was all the way on the floor. She stood over him, breathing harder than she wanted to, wrist complaining, and took 3 seconds to assess. He was breathing, he was unconscious, he would probably have a serious headache for the next week. She zip-stripped his wrists using the restraints on his own tactical vest. She'd done that enough times in enough bad places to know that the best restraints were always the ones the other side brought with them, and moved toward the corridor interior. The central nurse's station had 4 corridors branching off it. 3 were clear from this angle. The 4th, the north-facing one, had a door at the far end that was blocked with a crash cart pushed sideways across the frame, not blocking the door, blocking the sightline into the room beyond it. Someone on the other side had improvised a visual barrier. She moved to the nurse's station and picked up the desk phone. No dial tone. Line was cut. She checked the monitors. 3 vitals feeds still active, all reading within survivable range, one of them elevated in the way that said someone was running on adrenaline and pain rather than anything structural. "Clear," she said, loud enough to reach the north corridor. "Sinclair, floor 3. I'm coming toward you." Silence. Then a man's voice, tight with controlled pain. "Approach with your hands visible." She set the weapon on the nurse's station counter and walked toward the north corridor with her hands at shoulder height. Past the crash cart, through the doorway. The room was a standard VIP suite, bigger than the floor rooms, a window that had been covered with the privacy curtain, a couch along one wall that someone had shoved against the door at some point, and then moved back. 2 people were in the room. A woman in tactical clothing was propped against the far wall with a field dressing on her upper arm, awake and sharp-eyed. A large man with silver hair and the kind of posture that didn't leave even when the rest of you was exhausted was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, one hand pressed to his left thigh, the other holding a secondary weapon pointed at the doorway. He looked at her hands, then he looked at her face. General Walter Price, 4 stars, 5 decades, the kind of face that had been weathered by about 30 more years of consequence than most people accumulated in a lifetime. Lowered the weapon approximately 2 inches. "Nurse Sinclair," he said. "General, you called this 12 minutes before it happened." "I called it an hour before it happened," she said. "I called it to the wrong people first, which cost time." She moved toward him, dropping her hands, and crouched to look at his thigh. "Tell me what happened to the leg." "Fragment, same exchange that hit Vasquez." He nodded toward the woman against the wall. "Went through the door frame." "Can you move it?" He demonstrated. Slow flex, then extension. Controlled pain response, no structural failure. Not arterial, or he'd have been unconscious 30 minutes ago. "I've had worse." "Everyone says that," she said. "It's not a competition." She looked at the field dressing on his thigh. Applied correctly, tight enough. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. She looked at Vasquez. You? Through, upper arm, Vasquez said. I can use it. For how long? A pause. Another hour, probably. DHS has units inbound, 18 minutes, she straightened. How many more are in the building? We counted 6 entering, Price said. We took down 2 on this floor. You have 2 on 3? 1 secured, 1 unaccounted for in the stairwell, injured. That's 5. The team's radio suggested at least 1 more element unaccounted for. He nodded slowly. The 6th. She looked at him. There's someone inside, he said. Has been for months. That's how they knew the building layout, the electrical systems, the timing windows. He held her gaze. It's why I'm here, Sinclair. Not for the cardiac evaluation. The evaluation is cover. I'm here to provide a controlled meeting point for the investigation. She absorbed this. You came here as bait. He didn't look apologetic. A more accurate term would be controlled asset in a documented location. That's a worse term. She looked at the window covered by the curtain. The sub-basement, federal evidence storage. Something shifted in his expression. You found out about that. The breaching kit in the air handling access on 4 told me there was something worth breaching. The administrator gave me the rest. Price was quiet for a moment. The storage unit contains documentation connecting a narcotics distribution network to 6 federal contractors and 2 members of the hospital's administrative oversight board. Physical evidence, drive copies, financial transfer records, signed distribution agreements. He paused. If that unit is breached and the evidence is removed or destroyed, the case collapses. So they have 2 objectives, Avery said. Remove you as a witness and destroy the physical evidence. If either one succeeds, the network survives. He looked at her steadily. The unit has a 16-minute destruction window built into its security protocol. If someone initiates a breach and isn't stopped within 16 minutes, the internal safe erase activates. She checked her watch. And the 6th man, the inside asset, has building access. Yes. Which means he may already be in the sub-basement. Price said nothing, which was confirmation enough. 16 minutes to breach. Automatic destruction sequence. Response units 18 minutes out. She did the arithmetic and it came up short no matter how she arranged the variables. I need to get down there, she said. Sinclair. His voice caught her at the door. The inside asset. We have reason to believe they're medical personnel, someone with legitimate building access at all hours. She turned back. One of your colleagues, he said. She stood in the doorway of the VIP suite and thought about everyone she'd seen on this floor in the last 9 hours. The rotation. The faces. The ones who had been where they should be and the ones who'd been somewhere slightly wrong. She thought about the charge nurse office key that Marcus had produced from his pocket. She thought about how quickly he'd told her about the sub-basement unit when the CEO called. She thought about the way he'd known to move patients without being told how. And she thought about what he'd said to her at the stairwell door. Whatever they told you about yourself when you left, I don't think it took. And the particular timing of it, right before she needed to be somewhere else, right when a few extra seconds of pause might have mattered. She was down the stairwell and through the floor 3 door in 40 seconds. The hall was empty. The 2 secured men were still on the floor. The first still unconscious, the second now fully awake and watching her with the particular attention of someone who had accepted his situation. She moved past them without stopping. The charge nurse office door was open. She'd left it open when she went to the stairwell. She always noted whether she'd left doors open or closed. She had left it open. It was open. She went in. The landline was still on the desk. The floor plan she'd sketched was where she'd left it. The pen was on the floor, which it hadn't been before. Small thing, easy to explain. Someone had brushed the desk in passing. Marcus's jacket was on the back of the chair. He hadn't been wearing his jacket when she last saw him in the hall. He'd taken it off at some point in the last hour, left it in here. His phone was in the front pocket. She saw the outline of it. She looked at the jacket for a long moment. Then she looked at the nurse's station through the open door, and the empty hallway, and the elevator at the far end, and the emergency lighting that made everything the same shade of amber that revealed nothing. She went to the supply key hook behind the station. The medication storage key, her key, the one she'd taken earlier, was back on the hook. She'd had it in her scrub pocket since 5:47 a.m. She checked her pocket. Empty. It had been taken. while she was in the stairwell, while she was on the 6th floor. Someone had gone into her pocket and taken a key she was carrying and returned it to its hook, not because they needed the key to medication storage. They'd have had their own access, but because someone had been in her pocket and she hadn't felt it, which meant someone had been close enough to be in her pocket and she hadn't noticed. And the only person who had been that close to her in the last 2 hours was the man who'd been at her shoulder all night, acting helpful and afraid and very, very cooperative. She picked up the house phone. She called the sub-basement extension number she'd found in the building directory on the charge nurse's computer an hour ago when she'd been pulling phone numbers. It rang once. A voice answered. Marcus Webb's voice, not frightened, not exhausted, none of the textures she'd been reading off him all night. Just flat and professional and entirely stripped of everything she'd thought she knew about him. You're faster than I expected, he said. She kept her voice completely even. How far into the breach are you? A pause. A sound in the background that she recognized, the low mechanical hum of a security panel being overridden. Far enough. How many minutes on the destruction window? He didn't answer. Marcus. She pressed the handset hard against her ear. If you trigger the safe erase and DHS arrives to find you in a federal evidence facility, you're not walking out of this building as anything except a federal prisoner. The network you're protecting will have no reason to protect you. You know that. A longer pause. They have my sister. The words landed differently from everything else he'd said tonight. She stayed quiet for a second. What? They have my sister. His voice had changed, the professional flatness cracking just enough to let something real through, something tired and raw. They've had her for 4 months. That's how long I've been... He stopped. They said if I didn't complete the breach, What's her name? Silence. Marcus. What is your sister's name? Danny, said quietly, like it cost him something. Danielle, she's 23. Is she in Caldwell Bay? I don't know where she is. That's the point. I don't know where she is, and they do. His voice was coming apart slightly at the edges now, the professional training that had held it steady all night losing its grip on the exhaustion and the fear underneath. I don't have a choice. You have a choice, she said. You've had a choice all night. What you don't have is good options. She moved toward the stairwell door, handset cord stretching. Stop what you're doing. Don't touch the panel. DHS is 18 minutes out, less now. And they have the resources to find Danielle if you give them something to work with. If you trigger that sequence, you have nothing left to bargain with. The hum in the background shifted pitch slightly. Don't! Her voice came out harder than she intended. Marcus, do not touch that panel. A sound that might have been him exhaling. You should have let me go to the storage room when I offered. I know. She did know, in retrospect, what that offer had been. A test of her attention, or an attempt to position himself at the target before she was watching, or possibly both. That was a mistake. I'm acknowledging it. Now I need you to stop. If I stop, they'll know I didn't complete it. Donnie, if DHS can't find Danielle Webb through an active federal investigation into the network that has her, then no one can. That's your best option. At the stairwell door. Where in the sub-basement are you? Which section? East wall. Behind the maintenance corridor. A pause. She has a tattoo, he said suddenly, on her left wrist, a compass. She got it the summer she turned 17. I told her it was stupid, and she said she needed to always know which way was north. His voice had gone very quiet. I need you to know that in case... East wall behind the maintenance corridor, Avery said. I'm coming. Don't touch anything. She went through the stairwell door and hit the stairs going down. The sub-basement was 2 levels below her. She took the stairs at a pace that was the fastest she could maintain without losing her footing in the red emergency lighting, one hand on the railing, counting floors by the door markings. Ground floor. Below ground. Sub-basement. The door down here was heavier than the others. Steel core, with a digital access panel that had already been bypassed. The panel face hanging open with its wiring exposed. She went through. The sub-basement maintenance corridor was narrow and poorly lit, even in normal operation. Long runs of pipes along the ceiling, equipment housing units, the smell of recycled air, and something industrial underneath. The floor was poured concrete. Her footsteps were loud no matter how she placed them, and she stopped trying to muffle them. Marcus, she said into the space. Ahead of her at the end of the corridor, a light, small, blue-white, the glow of a portable work lamp. She moved toward it. I was standing in front of a vault door set into the east wall, a door that wouldn't have been obvious to anyone who wasn't looking for it. The same gunmetal gray as the wall panels around it. No signage, no markings, just a recessed handle and a 12-digit security panel. The panel was open, its internals exposed, with a small device clipped to the circuit board and a tablet screen showing a running progress bar. He turned when he heard her. He looked terrible, pale, dark under the eyes, with the expression of someone who had been holding a weight for 4 months that was finally too heavy and they had just put it down and didn't know what came next. He was still in his scrubs. He still had his hospital ID clipped to his chest. "I didn't push it," he said. "The sequence. I didn't push it." She looked at the tablet. The progress bar was at 62%. The breach program was still running, working through the panel's encryption, but nothing had been triggered yet. "Unclip the device," she said. He reached for it. From the corridor behind her, from the direction she'd come, from somewhere above in the stairwell, she heard the unmistakable sound of a door being opened with force, and then footsteps that were not moving with the careful tread of medical personnel or DHS agents arriving on protocol. The sixth man. The one she hadn't been able to account for. He'd been waiting. He'd let the night play out. Let the entry teams run their assault. Let her spend herself managing the floor. Let Marcus move into position. And now, with the breach 62% complete and the response unit still minutes away, he was coming to finish it. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the vault door and the device and the tablet and the corridor behind her and ran the options in the approximately 2 seconds she had before the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairwell. "Get behind the door," she said. "Avery, get behind the vault door, now." He moved. She reached past him and yanked the device off the circuit board. The progress bar froze at 62%, incomplete, the breach stalled, and she closed the panel face and stepped back into the center of the corridor and turned to face the maintenance access door. It opened. The man who came through was not wearing a maintenance uniform or tactical clothing. He was wearing a physician's coat, white, with a hospital ID, Harlow General, a name she'd seen in the staff directory, and placed with a face that had been in the building legitimately every day for 2 years. Dr. Elliot Marsh. Radiology. He was holding a weapon. He looked at her in the narrow corridor in the blue-white work lamp light, with the vault door behind her and no other exits and the breach device in her hand, and he took in all of it with the rapid assessment of someone who had been running contingencies all night. "You're the floor nurse," he said. "Yes." "You should be on 3. "I get that a lot." She looked at him steadily. "The breach is stalled. The device is in my hand. You're not getting into that vault tonight." He raised the weapon. At this range, in this corridor, there was no margin. "Put it down," he said. She didn't move. "Nurse." He said it the way Preston Hale had said it on the floor upstairs in a different lifetime, before all of this. Like it was a diminishing, like it was the end of a conversation. "Put it down." She thought about 22 patients behind closed doors on floor 3. She thought about Vasquez with a through-and-through on 6, and the general with a fragment in his thigh, and the man bleeding on the landing between 4 and 5. She thought about Danielle Webb with a compass tattoo on her left wrist, who needed someone to find her. She thought about the 4 months Marcus Webb had carried something that had bent him close to breaking. She thought about the fact that the response units were now approximately 9 minutes out, and she needed to still be standing when they got here. She looked at Elliot Marsh in his physician's coat with his hospital ID and his weapon, and she said very quietly, "You spent 2 years in this building, treated patients, filed charts, went to staff meetings." She paused. "And you were going to let them burn this whole thing down around everyone in it?" Something flickered in his face. Not remorse, something harder to name. He took 1 step toward her. Behind him, through the maintenance access door he'd left open, she heard something that her body registered before her brain fully processed it. The sound of a signal, a 3-tone burst on a tactical frequency, the specific pattern used by DHS rapid response units to announce secured entry. They were early. Marsh heard it too. His eyes moved toward the door for exactly half a second. Avery threw the breach device at his face and closed the distance between them before he finished flinching, and the corridor was narrow, and the light was bad, and neither of those things was her problem. The corridor was narrow enough that his reach advantage meant almost nothing. Marsh was bigger than her, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that came from never having been seriously tested. And the half-second of flinching from the thrown device was already closing as she came into his space. He got his left arm up and caught her across the shoulder instead of the throat, which cost him his grip on the weapon. The weapon hit the concrete floor and skidded toward the vault door. She didn't go for it. Going for it meant turning her back on him, and turning her back on him meant giving up the only advantage she currently had, which was being closer to him than his arms could effectively function. She drove her elbow into his solar plexus. Not a clean connection. He was already moving. It landed on his lower ribs instead, and felt him grunt and absorb it in the way that large men absorbed hits that would have stopped smaller ones, which was frustrating but not surprising. He got a hand in her hair. She tucked her chin, dropped her weight, and went with the pull rather than against it, let herself be dragged forward, and used that momentum to drive her knee into the outside of his thigh, targeting the peroneal nerve, and his leg buckled briefly. Not enough. He was still upright and still had her hair, and the narrow corridor meant she couldn't create distance. She stopped trying to create distance. She went for his wrist instead, both hands, full grip, the kind of technique that only worked in close quarters and only if you committed to it entirely, and rotated his wrist against its natural plane until she felt and heard the joint protest. And he released her hair to manage the pain, and in that half-second she stepped back and hit him in the throat with the flat of her hand. Not hard enough. He staggered, coughing, went into the wall, and she looked at the weapon on the floor and the vault door and Marcus frozen behind it, and made the decision that the weapon was still not worth the second it would cost her to pick it up. Marsh was back up in 3 seconds. His face was red and his eyes were different. The professional composure gone, something rawer underneath, the particular anger of someone who had expected this to be the easy part. "You're a floor nurse," he said, throat rough. "You keep saying that like it's supposed to matter." He came at her again, faster this time, and she was tired. Her wrist from the stairwell was aching in a sustained way that said the joint had been stressed beyond what a compression wrap was going to fix, and her shoulder from his forearm hit was going to be a problem by tomorrow. And when he got his hands on her this time, she couldn't fully break the grip. She got his thumb. She got his thumb at the proximal joint and applied pressure in the direction thumbs did not go, and Elliot Marsh, radiologist, Harlow General, 2 years of quiet access, 4 months of facilitated coercion, made a sound that was not professional or composed and went down to one knee. She stepped back. Her breathing was harder than she wanted it to be. From above them, through the ceiling and the stairwell and whatever structural medium sound chose to travel through in this building, she heard movement. Not the random noise of an occupied hospital. The specific patterned movement of multiple trained people moving through a building they'd been briefed on, clearing rooms in sequence, working from the outside in. DHS was in the building. She looked at Marsh on the floor, cradling his hand, breathing through his teeth. "Don't get up," she said. He looked up at her. The physician's coat was twisted sideways. His hospital ID had flipped over on its lanyard. He had the expression of a man watching something he'd spent a long time building collapse in a hallway that smelled like recycled air and concrete. And some part of him was still trying to calculate a path out of it. "You don't understand what this is," he said. "I understand exactly what this is." She picked up the weapon from the floor, finally, because now there was distance enough to manage it safely, and held it with the barrel down. "You were the inside access. You've been adjusting security logs, managing camera coverage, keeping the right people unaware and the wrong people informed. You were how they knew where the general was and when his detail would be at minimum staffing." He said nothing. "And when they needed someone to facilitate the breach and someone to clean up anything that didn't go according to plan," she looked at him steadily. "They sent you down here." "They would have killed people who matter to me," he said. "That's not a justification. It's a fact. I know about coercion." She thought about Marcus behind the vault door. "I know what it looks like and I know what it costs. I'm not dismissing it." She held his gaze. "But you had 2 years of access and 4 months of active facilitation, and somewhere in all of that, there were decisions that were yours." He looked away. She heard the maintenance access door at the far end of the corridor open and the particular sound of people who knew how to enter a space entering it correctly. Low, disciplined, covering angles. She raised the weapon barrel up with 2 fingers and said loudly and clearly, "Sinclair, floor 3 nursing staff. I have one person secured and one cooperating witness. No shots fired down here. A light swept the corridor. Hands. She put both hands up, weapon still raised by 2 fingers. Right hand has a firearm recovered from the secured individual. I'm setting it on the floor. Set it on the floor. She crouched and placed it carefully, and stepped back and put both hands back up, and 4 DHS agents in full tactical kit moved through the corridor with the organized efficiency of people who had practiced this specific scenario enough times that it was close to automatic. 2 went past her to Marsh. 1 stopped in front of her and looked at her face, and then at her hands, and then at her face again. "You're the nurse," he said. "Yes." Harmon said to find the nurse first. "I'm flattered." He almost smiled. "Are you injured?" "Wrist and shoulder. Not urgent." She nodded toward the vault door. Behind that door is a cooperating witness, Marcus Webb, resident physician. He needs to be secured but handled carefully. There's a coercion element, and there's a missing person connected to the network. His sister. Danielle Webb, 23, compass tattoo, left wrist. She needs to be found before whoever is holding her gets word the operation is blown. The agent was already talking into his earpiece before she finished the sentence. "VIP on 6, she said. "Secure. Detail has 2 casualties, 1 critical, 1 walking. General price is ambulatory." 1 critical. She put that down in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed to be dealt with later and turned to face the vault door. "Marcus," she said, "DHS is here. Come out slowly, hands visible, and say your name clearly." A pause. Then the vault door opened and Marcus Webb came out with his hands at shoulder height and his hospital ID still clipped to his chest, and the expression of someone who had stepped off a ledge in the dark and had not yet finished falling. He looked at Avery, and then at the agents, and then back at Avery. "Danny," he said, "they're looking for her now." She held his gaze. "Tell them everything. Every contact point, every instruction, every person you interacted with inside the network. Every detail you remember about where they communicated from, what devices they used, what language they used. Don't hold anything back thinking it'll protect her. The more they have, the faster they find her." He nodded. He looked very young suddenly. "I'm sorry," he said. I'm sorry." She didn't respond to that immediately, because sorry was complicated and she was tired and her wrist was genuinely hurting now. "Tell them about Danny," she said. "That's the most important thing you can do right now." An agent stepped forward and guided Marcus aside with a hand on his shoulder that wasn't unkind, and Avery turned and started walking back toward the stairwell. The process of DHS securing a hospital building was neither fast nor quiet. By 7:15 a.m., Harlow General was a different place than it had been at 5:47. The parking structure across the street had 4 federal vehicles blocking the 4th-level ramp. The white panel van had been flagged and was now surrounded by a forensics team that was working it with the patient, methodical attention of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. 2 ambulances were at the rear entrance. The critical member of General Price's detail, already en route to the regional trauma center with a Harlow General trauma nurse, not Avery, she wasn't cleared to leave yet, managing his condition in transit. Avery sat in the ground floor family consultation room with a compression wrap around her wrist and a paper cup of water that someone had brought her at some point and that she hadn't touched. The DHS debrief had been thorough and professional and had taken 47 minutes, conducted by a woman named Special Agent Deirdre Yunt, who asked precise questions and wrote almost nothing down, which meant she was recording the conversation, which Avery had expected and didn't mind. She'd told Yunt everything in the same order it had happened, without editorializing, without self-justification, without the kind of narrative smoothing that turned chaotic hours into tidy stories. The night had not been tidy. People had gotten hurt who might not have if she'd made different calls earlier. She said that too. Yunt had looked at her for a moment after that and said, "We found evidence of security log manipulation going back 14 months. Marsh had been building cover access for this operation for a year before it went active. There was no version of this morning where your early actions prevented all casualties." "I know," Avery said. "That doesn't change the math." "No," Yunt said. "It doesn't." She'd closed her folder. "We found Danielle Webb." Avery looked up. "She was being held at a private property 2 hours outside Caldwell Bay. Our field team made contact 40 minutes ago. She's physically unharmed." A pause. "Frightened, but unharmed." The compression wrap on Avery's wrist was slightly too tight, and she'd been ignoring it for the last hour. She adjusted it now, not because the timing mattered, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "Does Marcus know?" "He's being told right now." She nodded, looked at the wall. "What happens to him?" "That's for the DA to determine." Yunt's voice was carefully neutral. "Cooperating witness status has been requested. Given the coercion documentation and the extent of his cooperation tonight, the request will likely be considered seriously." A pause that had a specific quality to it. "He did stop the breach, voluntarily, before you reached the sub-basement." Avery absorbed this. "You have that on the panel's internal log." The device records every interaction. It stopped at 62%, and the record shows no further input from the user after that point. Yunt looked at her. "He stopped it himself, and then he called you." She thought about Marcus in the corridor saying, "They have my sister," with 4 months of something terrible in his voice. She thought about a young woman with a compass tattoo who needed to know which way was north. She didn't say anything else about it. There was nothing else to say that the record didn't already say better. At 8:30 a.m., the day shift arrived to a hospital that had been partially cordoned off and was operating at reduced capacity, with federal agents in the corridors and patients who had spent 2 hours behind closed doors now being given careful, minimal explanations by a nursing staff that had been briefed in shifts. The official statement was a security incident, investigation ongoing, no patients harmed. Dr. Preston Hale arrived at 8:45 in his usual self-important rush and was stopped at the third-floor elevator by a DHS agent who told him the floor was restricted and asked him to wait in the ground-floor conference room. Hale, apparently, did not respond well to being asked to wait. Avery heard about this secondhand from Brody Callahan, who had spent the night moving patients and fielding questions and keeping his composure in a way that she had not expected from him and intended to say so directly when the opportunity arose. Brody had witnessed the Hale exchange from the elevator lobby and reported it with the particular contained satisfaction of someone who had spent a year and a half being dismissed by the same man. He said he was an attending physician and he had rounds, Brody said. The agent said, "I understand that, sir. If you could just wait in the conference room." And Hale said something about knowing the hospital board personally. He paused. The agent said, "That's fine, sir. The conference room is through the lobby on your left." Another pause. Hale waited in the conference room. Avery drank the water, which had gone lukewarm. She was cleared to leave the consultation room at 9:10 and walked back toward the third-floor stairwell. The elevators were still restricted, and stopped at the landing between ground and 1, because her legs had decided that this was actually as far as they were willing to take her without a moment's acknowledgement of the fact that she had been awake and operational for over 10 hours, and her wrist hurt, and her shoulder hurt, and she'd hit a man in the throat and gone down a stairwell in the dark, and there was a specific tax the body charged for all of that, regardless of how the mind wanted to manage it. She sat down on the landing. Just for a minute. The stairwell was quiet. The red emergency lighting had been replaced by normal white when DHS restored full building power at 7:40, and everything was just a stairwell now. Gray walls, painted metal railing, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere above her. Ordinary. The specific, unremarkable ordinariness that only registered as precious when you'd spent a few hours in spaces where things were the opposite. She thought about the landing between 4 and 5 where the injured man had been sitting, pressing his hand into his side, telling her his assignment parameters with the flat effect of someone who had made a calculation and was living inside it. He'd been transported at 7:20. She didn't know his name, she'd given his approximate location and condition to the DHS team, and they'd found him, and she'd asked the agent to make sure the responding medic knew about the internal fragment angle. And he'd looked at her in a way that made her realize he'd assumed she was just a floor nurse who'd had a frightening night, and she hadn't corrected the assumption because it was almost true. She heard the stairwell door below her open. Footsteps coming up, measured, deliberate, with the slight irregularity that said someone was managing an injury in their leg but unwilling to change their pace for it. She knew the cadence before she saw the person. General Walter Price came around the landing below her, left thigh wrapped in what was clearly a field dressing beneath his slacks, and stopped when he saw her sitting on the step. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down on the step below hers, which put them almost at eye level, and said nothing for a moment. She waited. "The detail member who was critical," he said. Sergeant First Class Nadia Obi. She came through surgery 40 minutes ago. She's going to be all right. Avery exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding something against the possibility that the answer would be different. Good, she said. Price looked at his hands for a moment. Large hands, scarred across the knuckles in ways that were the residue of decades, not any single event. You told my team to move me before the breach, he said. If you hadn't, the detail would have caught it. Probably. He looked at her. But they would have caught it with less time than they had. The perimeter warning gave them approximately 4 minutes of additional preparation. In an 8-person assault on a contained position, 4 minutes is significant, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. You've been out 14 months. 15, as of last week. And you're working floor nursing at a civilian hospital in a coastal city. Yes, sir. By choice. Yes. He studied her face with the particular attention of someone who'd spent a long career learning to read what people weren't saying. Did it work? Whatever you were trying to do by leaving. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Mrs. Okafor saying, "You look like you're carrying something heavy in the blue dark of Bay 6. She thought about sitting on this landing because her body had simply stopped cooperating with her preference to keep moving. I'm a good nurse, she said finally. I don't doubt that. I'm a different kind of good at it than I was at the other thing. It's, she paused, quieter, in a way that I thought I needed. And did you need it? She looked at the wall. I needed something. I'm not sure I correctly identified what. Price was quiet for a moment. Then, the joint task force that General Price, that I am a cooperating witness for. The network that Marsh was facilitating access for. There are 6 federal contractors implicated, 2 administrative board members, and a distribution chain that runs through 4 states. He paused. The investigation goes to trial in 4 months. The prosecution's case needs the sub-basement evidence to hold. You kept that intact tonight. Marcus kept it intact. He stopped the breach before I reached him. You called him and gave him a reason to stop. I gave him information. He made the decision. Price looked at her for a moment. You're doing it again. What? Not taking credit for the thing you did. He said it without judgment, mostly. I've known a lot of people who did that. Some of them because they were genuinely humble, and some of them because it was easier than accepting that what they were capable of had consequences they hadn't chosen. He paused. You're not humble. She surprised herself by almost laughing. No. So it's the other thing. She didn't answer. He stood, carefully, managing the leg, and looked down at her. The task force is going to need a debrief on everything you observed tonight, not just the tactical elements, the administrative failures that made access possible, the internal security gaps, the supply chain anomaly you identified in the pharmaceutical inventory. He paused. That debrief is going to be with people who are going to have some questions about who you are and how you knew what you knew. I know. And after that debrief, there are going to be some conversations that you may or may not want to have about whether floor nurse in Caldwell Bay is actually the right permanent answer. She looked up at him. He wasn't pushing. His face was neutral. The specific neutrality of someone who had learned that the most effective version of an invitation was one that didn't feel like pressure. You don't have to decide anything today, he said. I know that too. He nodded once, started to go, then stopped. Lieutenant Commander, he said, her rank, the one she hadn't used in 15 months, sitting in the air of the stairwell, like something she'd put down and wasn't sure she'd pick back up. Whatever you decide, what you did this morning, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't seem to feel he needed to. He went up the stairs. She listened to his footsteps even out above her, the injured leg finding its rhythm, and then she sat with the quiet for another minute. Then she stood up, because there were patients on floor 3 who had spent a frightening night behind closed doors, and someone needed to go check on them, and she was still the person who knew where Mrs. Okafor's call button was and how Harold preferred his pillows positioned and which monitors on the floor were running slightly behind on their calibration. She was still the nurse on this floor. That was still true. By noon, the story had started to move. Not publicly, not yet. DHS had a media hold on the incident pending arrest processing and federal evidence protocols. But inside the building, in the way that information moved through any institution where people spent long hours in close proximity with shared stakes. The shape of the night had started to emerge. Brody had talked to 3 people. Those 3 had talked to others. By the time the day shift overlap happened at 11:30, there were conversations in the break room and at the nurses' station and in the corridor outside the pharmacy that all had the same particular texture. People trying to reconcile the version of Avery Sinclair they had categorized and filed and occasionally dismissed with the account of what she'd done between 5:47 a.m. and 7:15 a.m. She was aware of this the way she was aware of most things she would have preferred not to be aware of. People looked at her slightly differently when she came back onto the floor. Not all of them. Some of them were too busy or too tired or too practically focused on the work, but enough that the shift in the air was measurable. Preston Hale came out of the ground floor conference room at 11:45. He walked to the 3rd floor because the elevators were still only partially restored to civilian use. And he came onto the floor and found Avery at the nurses' station, updating charts with the unhurried efficiency she brought to everything. And he stood there for a moment in the way of someone who had prepared a version of how this encounter would go and was now discovering that the version needed revision. She looked up. "Dr. Hale." He looked at her for a moment. "I was not, as far as she could tell, a man built for the particular kind of reckoning this morning required. He was built for authority, for the comfortable assumption of competence, for the 1,000 small moments of professional life where being the physician in the room meant being the person deferred to. This was a different kind of moment. They briefed me," he said, "in the conference room. What happened overnight?" "Okay. They told me—" He stopped, started again. "I didn't know what you were. Your background." "You didn't need to know my background," she said. "You needed to know I was competent." He absorbed this. I haven't been." He stopped a 3rd time, and she watched him work through the frustrating experience of trying to say something true that he'd had very little practice saying. "I have not treated you appropriately," he said finally, "as a member of this team." She looked at him steadily. "No, you haven't." He got the word out slowly, like it weighed more than it should have for a 2-syllable word. "Sorry." She nodded once, not warmly. She wasn't there yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she was, but honestly. "Okay." He seemed like he wanted to say something else and couldn't find it, so he went down the hall toward his office, and she went back to the charts. Brody appeared at her elbow approximately 30 seconds later. Did he actually just apologize? In a limited way. I've never seen him apologize to anyone. It was his first time, you could tell. Brody was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay? Like, actually?" She finished the entry she was on and looked at him. I was 26, and his hair was slightly crazy from the night, and he had the earnest, slightly crumpled look of someone who had discovered that they were capable of more than they'd given themselves credit for and wasn't quite sure what to do with that discovery. "I'm fine," she said. "That's what you said last night when you definitely weren't fine." "Last night I was managing a situation. This is different." She looked at him. "You did well tonight. The patient management. Keeping them calm, keeping them in their rooms. You did that well." He blinked. "I was following your instructions." "You were following instructions you trusted even when they didn't come with explanations. That's a different skill." She paused. "Not everyone can do that." He looked like he wasn't entirely sure how to process being told he'd done something right by someone he'd spent the last hour trying to figure out how to properly acknowledge. "Thanks," he said finally, a little awkward. "Don't thank me. Eat something. You've been on since 9 last night." He went to find food. She went to check on Mrs. Okafor, who was sitting up in her bed in Bay 6 with her television on and her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression of someone who had spent the night being told minimal information and was prepared to have a full conversation about it. "I want to know everything," Mrs. Okafor said. "You want to know what I can tell you." "Is that less than everything?" "Somewhat less." She looked at Avery's wrist. "What happened to your arm?" "Minor injury. From the thing that happened last night that you're only going to tell me somewhat about." "Yes." Mrs. Okafor was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "You kept us safe," she said. Not a question. "Everyone on this floor is fine." "I know. I asked Brody." She paused. "I'm asking you specifically." Avery looked at her. 63 years old, sharp mind, sharper tongue, hip replacement at 63 because she'd spent her 50s working 12-hour warehouse shifts to put 2 kids through school and her joints had paid the bill. She was the kind of person who saw things because she'd lived long enough to stop being distracted by surfaces. "Everyone on this floor is fine," Avery said again. Mrs. Okafor nodded slowly. "Good." She settled back against her pillows. "You can check my chart now. I know you're going to anyway." Avery almost smiled. She picked up the chart. The afternoon moved in the rhythm of a floor finding its footing after a night that had knocked it sideways. The federal presence reduced through the early afternoon hours as the scene processing completed and custody transfer finished, and the long, unglamorous machinery of federal prosecution began its work. DHS agent Yunt stopped by the floor at 2:15 to inform Avery that all 6 assault team members had been accounted for, 3 in custody, 2 confirmed dead on site, the man from the 4-5 landing in federal medical custody and expected to survive. She also told her, quietly and without preamble, that Elliot Marsh had been formally arrested and processed, and that his preliminary attorney had already submitted a motion challenging the scope of the evidence, which Yunt relayed with the specific, contained expression of someone who had seen that motion submitted in approximately 30 prior cases and had never once seen it succeed. "He'll cooperate," Yunt said. "Eventually. They always do when the physical evidence is as complete as this." "The supply chain," Avery said. "The pharmaceutical inventory anomaly. Already flagged for forensic accounting. The State Pharmacy Board has been notified." Yunt paused. 2 members of this hospital's Administrative Oversight Board have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. One of them is the person who approved Marsh's extended building access request 14 months ago. Avery looked at her. "Approved it or facilitated it?" "That's what the investigation will determine." Yunt's voice was careful. "There's a distinction between negligence and participation." "And which one were they?" A pause. "There is evidence," Yunt said slowly, "suggesting that the access approval was not entirely administrative error. The weight of that landed the way those things landed when you'd been expecting them and were still not entirely prepared." Not surprised. Avery had drawn the same conclusion at 2 a.m. when she'd been looking at the floor plan and the blue marks and trying to understand how a coordinated assault team had acquired the level of building knowledge they'd demonstrated. Surprise would have required more naivety than she currently possessed, but confirmation was its own different weight. "Who?" she said. Yunt looked at her for a moment. "That's still active. Who in the administration had access to the security log adjustment requests?" Another pause. "The requests were routed through the office of the hospital's chief operating officer." Harlow General's COO was a man named Dennis Farrow. She'd met him twice, once at a department orientation 18 months ago, once in the hall outside a board meeting she'd had no reason to attend. He'd looked through her both times the way administrators looked through floor nurses, which was to say, automatically and without registering anything. She thought about that now with a completely different quality of attention. "Farrow," she said. Yunt didn't confirm it. She also didn't deny it. "He's still in the building," Avery said. "I saw him on the ground floor this morning during the initial sweep. He was in the administrative cluster they moved to the East Conference Room." Yunt's expression didn't change, but she put her hand on her earpiece. Avery waited. Yunt said something quietly into the communication device, too low for Avery to catch. Then she was quiet for a moment, listening. Then her expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees in a direction that was not good. "He's not in the conference room," Yunt said. "When was he last confirmed?" "Building check at noon." She was already moving toward the door. "He was cleared from the East Conference Room at 12:40 and told he was free to go pending further contact from investigators. He'd been released 4 hours ago." While the investigation was still in its early processing, while the full scope of administrative involvement hadn't yet been confirmed, someone had cleared the building sweep without flagging the COO's access requests as significant, and Dennis Farrow had walked out of Harlow General at 12:40 p.m. Yunt was on the phone before she was fully through the door. Avery stood at the nurses' station on floor 3 in the afternoon light that came through the windows at the end of the hall, and thought about a man who had sat in an East Conference Room for 4 hours knowing exactly what the investigation was going to find, and waiting for the precise moment when someone decided he was administrative rather than operational and let him walk. 4 hours. He'd been patient enough to sit for 4 hours. That kind of patience didn't belong to someone who was improvising. She thought about the breaching kit and the air handling access on floor 4. She thought about an operation this intricate requiring months of preparation and multiple access points. She thought about a man who had approved building access for a radiologist 14 months ago and had been in the hospital all morning watching the federal response deploy and assessing exactly how much they already knew. She thought about the one element of the night she hadn't been able to account for: the signal in the stairwell. The three-tone burst on the DHS frequency that had made Marsh look toward the door, that she'd assumed was the response units announcing entry. She'd heard it 8 minutes before DHS confirmed they were in the building. She picked up the nearest phone and dialed Yunt's number. It rang twice. Yunt? The entry signal on the DHS frequency at approximately 6:47 a.m., Avery said. Was that your units? A pause. Short. Our units entered at 6:55. You didn't announce on frequency at 6:47. No. 8 minutes. Someone had transmitted a DHS tactical frequency burst 8 minutes before the real units arrived. Someone who had the frequency. Someone who had been monitoring the response timeline and knew approximately when units would arrive and had transmitted early to disrupt the situation in the sub-basement at a specific moment. Not to help Avery. To make Marsh hesitate. To introduce uncertainty at the moment when the breach was 62% complete and might have been pushed through if Marcus had been certain he had another 8 minutes. Someone had wanted the breach to fail. Not Avery. Not DHS. Someone who wanted the evidence preserved and the breach operation burned. Someone who had known about both objectives, the general and the vault, and had been running a separate calculation all night about which outcome served them better. Yunt, she said. Farrow didn't leave. A silence on the line. He let you see him leave, Avery said. He walked out the front at 12:40 and he's still in the building, or on the grounds. And he has a DHS frequency transmitter and access to the building's electrical systems, and he has been watching this investigation process for 4 hours while he figures out whether there's still something in that vault worth getting to. Another silence, longer. The vault, Yunt said. It's still sealed? As of my last check at 9 a.m. We had an agent on it until 11. And after 11? The pause that followed that question was the answer. Yunt was already issuing orders before Avery finished the sentence. She could hear it through the phone, the shift in background noise, the immediate multiplication of voices, the particular organized urgency of a federal team that had just been told to reverse a decision made 4 hours ago and had approximately no time to do it gracefully. Yunt's voice remained level through all of it, which was the most reassuring thing about her. I need every exit point covered, Yunt said, not to Avery, to someone in the room with her. Sub-basement access, loading dock, maintenance exits, roof access, everything. Then back to Avery. Is there any way he gets into the sub-basement from an access point we don't have mapped? Avery was already walking. Not running. Running on a hospital floor caused panic, and there were patients on this floor who'd had enough of that for one day. But moving with the particular purposeful speed that looked, from a distance, like someone who simply knew where they were going. The air handling access on 4, she said. It connects to the maintenance infrastructure. I don't know the full layout of the utility corridors below ground level. We have building schematics. When did you get them? A pause. This morning. From the hospital's facilities department? Another pause, this one with a specific quality. Yes. Farrow had access to the facilities department. She went through the stairwell door and took the stairs down. If he's been planning a fallback since this morning, he may have had 4 hours to think about which utility routes aren't on the version of the schematics he knew you'd obtain. She heard Yunt relay this in a compressed sentence to someone else. Then, Sinclair, I need you to stay on your floor. I'm already in the stairwell. I understand that. I need you. Yunt. She kept her voice even. I've been in the air handling access on 4. I've been in the sub-basement maintenance corridor. I know the physical layout of those spaces in a way that a schematic doesn't fully convey. If Farrow gets to that vault before your team gets to him, we are back to the same problem we had at 6:47 this morning, except this time there's no breach device to interrupt. A silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Stay on the line, Yunt said. She kept going down. The sub-basement door was exactly as she'd left it. Steel core, access panel hanging open from the bypass, the exposed wiring that Marcus had worked through now coiled to one side by the forensics team that had processed the space at 8 a.m. She went through and stood in the maintenance corridor entrance and listened. The blue-white work lamp she'd used earlier was gone, taken as evidence. The space was lit by the corridor's standard industrial fluorescence, which gave everything a flat, even brightness that was somehow less useful than the directional work lamp had been. She moved toward the vault door. It was sealed. The panel face was closed and latched, the handle recessed, the door looking exactly like a wall panel because that was the point of it. She checked the panel. No interference marks beyond what was already there from Marcus's bypass attempt, which she knew the texture of. Nothing new. She turned and looked at the length of the maintenance corridor behind her. It ran approximately 60 feet toward the east wall and then branched. A T-junction she'd clocked on her first pass but not explored because at the time she'd been focused on the vault and on Marsh and on the sound of footsteps coming down the stairwell. The right branch of the T disappeared around a corner. The left branch ended in a utility door that was, from this distance, sitting approximately 2 inches open. It had been closed when she'd left. She knew it had been closed because she had a specific trained habit of noting the status of every door in a space she was operating in, and that door had been flush with its frame when the DHS entry team had come through, because she'd looked at it while the agent had been telling her to put her hands up. She moved toward the T-junction. She was 10 feet from it when she heard him. Not footsteps. Breathing. The controlled, deliberate breathing of someone who was managing physical exertion and trying to minimize their acoustic signature, which was something you only did if you'd been trained to think about your acoustic signature, and Dennis Farrow had not, as far as she knew, any military or tactical background, which meant either she was wrong about that, or he'd been very well briefed by people who did. She stopped. The corridor was silent except for the fluorescent hum overhead. "Mr. Farrow," she said. A pause. Then, from around the right branch of the T, a voice she'd heard twice, once at an orientation, once in a hallway, that had registered then as the voice of a man who had decided she wasn't worth looking at directly. "How did you know I was still here?" Not a question, an assessment. "The frequency burst at 6:47, she said. "DHS didn't transmit until 6:55. You had their frequency and you used it to create an 8-minute window. That's not the move of someone who was trying to get into the vault tonight. That's the move of someone who was managing the timeline. You wanted the breach to fail." A longer silence. She stayed at the junction entrance, not going around the corner, keeping the wall between them. "The network," she said. "You're not protecting it. You're building a case against it." "That's a generous interpretation," he said. "Is it wrong?" The pause that followed was different from his previous pauses, less calculated, more like someone who had spent a long time carrying something in a specific direction and had just been asked if the direction was actually right. "The 2 board members," she said, "the ones placed on administrative leave. They're not the top of this." "No," he said, "they're not. You've been building documentation. That's why you wanted the vault intact, not because it contains the task force's evidence. It contains yours too." She heard him exhale. A long, controlled exhalation, the kind that preceded either a decision or a collapse. "There are names in that vault that the Joint Task Force doesn't have yet," he said. "I've been collecting them for 18 months. People above the contractors, above the board members, the people who designed the distribution architecture and insulated themselves from it by 3 layers of cutouts." A pause. "If the vault gets burned, those names go with it." She thought about 14 months of Elliot Marsh adjusting security logs and managing camera coverage. She thought about the assault team and the breaching kit and the extraordinary level of coordination required to mount an operation like this against a federally adjacent facility. That coordination required money, and it required authority. Not the authority of contractors and corrupted board members, but something above that. Something that could direct a 6-person assault team against a general and a federal evidence vault and consider it a manageable risk. "How far up does it go?" she said. "Far enough that the people involved were reasonably confident that even if the operation failed, the investigation would be managed at a level that kept their names off the primary record." He paused. "They were wrong about that, but they needed to be sure about the vault." She heard something. Not from around the corner, from above. Through the ceiling of the sub-basement, through the building's infrastructure, The sound of multiple sets of footsteps moving with coordinated purpose. DHS working the building from the top down. "They're in the building," she said. "If you come out now with documentation of what you have, you control the narrative of what you've been doing. If they find you in a restricted federal evidence space after you were observed leaving the building, you don't get to explain it. It becomes whatever the first report says it is." A long silence. "Pharaoh." She kept her voice level, not pushing, stating, "You've been doing something real for 18 months. Don't end it in a sub-basement because you ran out of time to think." The sound of footsteps from above was getting closer. Then she heard him move, not toward the vault, toward her. Around the corner of the T-junction, Dennis Pharaoh came into view. He was 54, with the unremarkable build of someone whose job was administrative and whose shoes cost more than most people's bi-weekly pay, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in a conference room for 4 hours rehearsing something and had finally decided the rehearsed version wasn't going to hold. He was holding a phone, not a weapon. A phone, with its screen showing a compressed file directory, dozens of folders labeled with dates and alphanumeric strings. "Encrypted backup," he said. "Everything that's in the vault, plus the supplementary documentation the task force doesn't have." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. Not guilt and not defiance, but something in between. The expression of someone who had made a very long series of decisions inside a situation with no clean options and was exhausted by all of them. "I need someone to hand this to who isn't going to let it disappear." She looked at the phone, then at him. "Yunt," she said into her own phone. "I heard," Yunt said on the line. "I'm 30 seconds from the sub-basement door. Do not let him move." "He's not moving," Avery said. Then to Pharaoh, "Give me the phone." He handed it to her. She held it and looked at him and thought about the particular shape of 18 months of doing something necessary in a way that required behaving like the opposite of what you were. She thought about the way he'd looked through her in the hallway outside the board meeting, and she didn't think it was malice now. She thought it was someone so deep inside a performance of normal that everything peripheral had stopped registering. "You knew about Marcus," she said. "You knew they had someone inside." "I suspected. I didn't know who." "But you transmitted on the DHS frequency to stop him at the breach." "I transmitted to create uncertainty. I didn't know what state the breach was in." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know you were in the building. I didn't know any of what happened on the floors above us. I've been in an evidence vault installing documentation backup since 2 in the morning, and the first thing I knew about the assault was when the power cut to floor 3 registered on the building management system I was monitoring from down here." She absorbed this. "You were here before they came in." "I've been building the supplementary file for 6 weeks. Last night was the scheduled completion." A pause. "The timing was not intentional." The sub-basement door opened and Yunt came through it with 2 agents behind her, and Avery held up the phone as Yunt crossed the corridor toward them. "Encrypted backup," Avery said. "He says it contains supplementary documentation beyond what the vault holds. Names above the board level." Yunt looked at Pharaoh with an expression that was professionally neutral in a way that took real effort to maintain. "Mr. Pharaoh, I need you to come with me." "I know," he said. He went. The full scope of what Dennis Pharaoh had been doing for 18 months took 3 days to begin to surface, and when it did, it surfaced in a way that changed the shape of everything that came after. He had not been protecting the network. He had been, in the imperfect, legally ambiguous, procedurally questionable way of someone who had concluded that the official channels were too compromised to trust, building a parallel documentation trail. The vault held the task force's evidence. The phone held Pharaoh's, 18 months of financial transfer analysis, communication records, contractor connections, and a set of names that reached into 2 state government offices and 1 federal agency that had been, according to the documentation, providing active protection to the distribution network in exchange for a percentage of its revenue. The task force had known about the contractors. They had not known about the state and federal layer above them. Pharaoh had known. And he had known that bringing it through official channels meant routing it through agencies that contained people with reasons to make it disappear. His methods were not clean. His decision to operate unilaterally rather than find a trusted external channel had created the circumstances that allowed Marsh's access to persist for 14 months without proper counterintelligence review. His silence about the insider threat had cost Sergeant First Class Nadia Obi a surgery. He acknowledged all of this in his federal interview, which Yunt described to Avery in a follow-up meeting 5 days after the incident, with the compact honesty of someone who had decided that partial truths were more dangerous than difficult, complete ones. He was not prosecuted. This was not a clean outcome. Avery understood that when Yunt told her, and she sat with it for a while without trying to resolve it into something that felt better than it did. The decision had been made above Yunt's pay grade and involved considerations that were not going to be fully explained to a floor nurse in a follow-up meeting, and Avery had been in enough rooms adjacent to those kinds of decisions to know that pushing on them rarely produced clarity and usually produced frustration. What she did know was that the names Farrow had documented led to 3 arrests in the following 2 weeks: a state comptroller's office director, a regional administrator at a federal regulatory agency, and the executive director of the contractor consortium that had designed the distribution network in the first place, a man named Jeffrey Aldrin, 61, whose name had not appeared in any of the task force's prior materials, and who was arrested at his home in a suburb outside the state capital on a Thursday morning while he was making coffee. She read about Aldrin's arrest in the news, because by then it had become public, because federal arrest records of that magnitude rarely stayed quiet for long, and the media had been piecing the story together since the day after the hospital incident. The coverage was careful. The hospital had been identified, the general's presence noted, the broad outline of the assault operation characterized correctly, but the internal details, the specific sequence of the night, the corridor and the stairwell and the sub-basement were not in any of the articles she read. She read them anyway. She read them the way you read accounts of things you were inside, checking the shape of it against what you remembered, finding the places where the outside view and the inside experience diverged. They diverged in the way they always did. The outside view was cleaner, cause and effect running in straight lines. The inside experience was a series of decisions made with incomplete information in amber light, some of which worked and some of which didn't, all of which had consequences that were still unfolding. Elliot Marsh entered a guilty plea on federal charges of conspiracy, obstruction of federal investigation, and facilitation of a violent assault on federal personnel. He was sentenced 6 months later to 14 years. The plea agreement required full cooperation with the task force investigation, which he provided. His attorney argued the coercion element at sentencing. The judge acknowledged it and sentenced him anyway, noting that 14 months of sustained facilitation exceeded what coercive circumstances could fully explain. Avery thought the judge was not wrong. She also thought the 14 years was something she didn't have a clean feeling about, because nothing about Elliot Marsh was clean, and she'd decided a long time ago that having clean feelings about complicated things was a form of dishonesty she wasn't interested in. The 2 administrative board members, both of whom had, as the investigation determined, crossed from negligence into active participation, faced separate criminal proceedings. One pled guilty immediately. The other went to trial and lost. Both were removed from their positions the morning of their respective charges, which was swift by institutional standards and still felt, to the people who had worked in that building and trusted that there was oversight, like it should have been faster. Dr. Preston Hale remained on staff at Harlow General. He was not implicated in anything. He was, as far as the investigation determined, exactly what he appeared to be: an arrogant, dismissive attending physician who had treated a colleague badly and had nothing to do with any of the rest of it. He did not apologize to her a second time. She did not expect him to. The first apology had been real and had cost him something, and she understood that people generally had a limited number of those in them, and she'd received his. What changed was subtler than a second apology. The way he spoke to her in handoff conversations, the way he stopped cutting her off in the corridor, the way he once, in the middle of a complicated patient situation 3 weeks after the incident, asked her what she thought before he made a call. She told him. He used it. It wasn't a transformation, it was an adjustment. She decided adjustments were the realistic version of change and accepted it. Brody Callahan was offered a position on the DHS Medical Liaison Advisory Panel that was formed in the aftermath of the investigation to examine civilian hospital security protocols. He turned it down because he'd realized during the long night of moving patients and closing doors that what he actually wanted to do was emergency nursing, and he enrolled in an advanced trauma certification program the following month. Avery wrote his recommendation letter and meant every word of it. Sergeant First Class Nadia Obi was out of the hospital in 11 days. She sent Avery a text message through a contact number that Avery assumed had been routed through approximately 4 layers of military communication protocol before reaching her, and it said, "Heard you kept the floor. Good work, Sinclair." 3 words of genuine evaluation from a career military professional was, in the language of people who communicated that way, effusive. Avery saved the message. Marcus Webb spent 72 hours in federal custody before his cooperating witness status was formally established and his conditions changed. He was not charged. This was the determination Avery had less ambivalence about than any other outcome of the investigation, because she had watched him make his decision in the sub-basement in real time, and she knew what it had cost him, and she thought the cost was sufficient, and the decision was what mattered. He came back to Harlow General 3 weeks after the incident, not as a resident. His residency position had been administratively suspended pending the investigation's completion, and the reinstatement process was going to take months. But as someone who had asked to speak with her, he came to the floor on a Tuesday afternoon when the census was manageable and found her at the nurse's station finishing an entry, and she looked up, and he was standing there in civilian clothes, looking like someone who'd been sleeping better than he had been, but was still putting himself back together in pieces. "Danny's home," he said. "I know," Yunt had told her the week before. It's going to take time," he paused. "She's got a good therapist. She's talking about going back to school in the spring." Another pause. "She asked me who found her." Avery waited. "I told her it was a federal investigation. A lot of people." He looked at her. "But you gave them the name and the description at 6 a.m., before anyone knew to look." "I knew to look because you told me." "I know." His voice had a quality she recognized, the quality of someone trying to accurately assign the weight of a thing that involved more than one person and didn't simplify cleanly. "I also know I spent 4 months making choices that put this whole thing in motion. I know those aren't separate." "No," she said. "They're not." He nodded. He'd expected her to say that. She could tell he'd expected it, and had come anyway, which told her something about who he was that the night in question had suggested but not confirmed. "I'm going to finish my residency," he said. "Somewhere else, probably. Different hospital. I don't think I can." Here is complicated," she agreed, "but I'm going to finish it." "Good." She meant it straightforwardly. "You're good at it. Even in a very bad night, you were good at it." He almost said something else and then didn't, and she understood that too, that sometimes the thing you need to say has already been said in the way that matters, and adding to it just makes it smaller. He left. She went back to the entry she'd been finishing. General Walter Price testified before a federal grand jury 6 weeks after the incident. His testimony, combined with the vault evidence and Farrow's supplementary documentation, resulted in a 43-count indictment against 11 individuals across the network, the most comprehensive prosecution the Joint Task Force had produced in its 4-year operation. He called her the evening before his testimony. She answered because the number was one she now recognized. "Tomorrow," he said. "I heard. It had been in the news, the trial's existence, if not the full detail. How's the leg?" "It's a leg," he said, which she interpreted as functional, and stopped asking. "I wanted to tell you before the public record made it official, your name is in the task force report. Your actions the night of the incident are formally documented as material to the preservation of federal evidence and the protection of a cooperating witness." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't like that," he said. "I don't—" She paused. "It's not that I don't like it. It's that my name in a federal report means questions, attention." She looked at the wall of her apartment, which was quiet in the way of evenings after long days. "I've been trying to be quiet for a while." "I know." He paused. "The report is a record. It doesn't obligate you to anything. You can keep being quiet afterward if that's what you decide." "But you don't think that's what I'll decide?" A pause. "I think you've had 15 months to test whether being quiet was actually the thing you needed," he said, "and you've discovered that it isn't a fixed answer, that it was the right answer for a while, and may or may not be the right answer now." He let that sit for a moment. "I also think the only person who gets to decide is you. I'm not going to push. You pushed a little last week. I suggested. There's a distinction. She looked at her window. Outside, Caldwell Bay was doing what it did in October. A low wind off the water, the particular quality of light that came at the end of the warm season, when it was remembering what it had been and not quite ready to let go. The program, she said. The one you mentioned, military to medicine. It's moving into formal development, he said. The proposal has departmental support. It needs someone who understands both sides from the inside, not theoretically. Someone who knows what gets lost in translation between those two worlds, and how to build a bridge that doesn't require veterans to give up who they were to become who they're going to be. She thought about the things she'd said to the general on the stairwell landing. I'm a good nurse. I'm a different kind of good at it than I was at the other thing. She thought about how those two things had felt like a contradiction for 15 months, like she had to hold them in separate hands and never let them touch, and how the night that everyone else would describe as a crisis had felt to her, in the hours when it was active, like the first time in a long time that both hands were doing the same work. She thought about veterans who came out of service and found that the civilian world had no map for what they'd learned, no category for what they knew, and no patience for the time it took to translate it into something the world understood how to value. She thought about what it might mean to build that map. It wouldn't be quiet, she said. No, he agreed. It would not. She looked at her window for a long moment. Tell me what the first stage looks like. The formal announcement came in February. The Harlow General Incident, which was how it was referred to in all public documents, which was a remarkably restrained way of describing a 6-person mercenary assault on a federal cooperating witness inside a civilian hospital, had produced, among its various institutional aftereffects, one that nobody in the initial reporting had anticipated: a significant public conversation about what happened to the specialized competencies of military medical personnel when they separated from service. The program that came out of that conversation was not named after Avery. She insisted on that, which was the first negotiation she had with the program's institutional committee, and which she won by simply declining to participate under any other terms. It was called the Bridge Initiative, which was not a name she'd chosen, but which she could live with, and it was formally housed within a partnership between the Department of Defense's Medical Education Division and a consortium of civilian hospital systems that included Harlow General. Its purpose was to create structured pathways for military medical personnel, combat medics, field surgeons, operational nurses, to transition into civilian emergency medicine without having to pretend that their previous training was irrelevant and without having to spend years proving to civilian institutions that what they knew had value. The bridge wasn't a shortcut. It was a recognition. There was a difference. Avery ran the pilot cohort herself, which meant she was no longer a floor nurse at Harlow General. She kept one shift per week because she'd talked about this with the program committee for an hour, and they'd agreed it wasn't ego, but it wasn't nothing either. It was the thing that kept her honest about what the work actually was, but was primarily running curriculum design and cohort mentorship, and the particular unglamorous work of convincing hospital administrators that a veteran with 3 combat deployments and a trauma certification was not a liability. The first cohort had 9 people. 4 had served in roles that included combat casualty care. 2 were former flight medics. 1 had been a field surgical technician. 1 was a former Army nurse who had separated 2 years before and had been working a retail job because the civilian nursing credential transfer process had taken 14 months and the bills hadn't waited. 1 was a 26-year-old Marine Corpsman named Danny Voss, who had done 2 deployments, come home, enrolled in a community college nursing program, and spent 18 months being condescended to by instructors who had never seen a traumatic hemorrhage outside a textbook. Danny Voss reminded her of nobody specific, and also, somehow, of everyone she'd known who had come out of service and found that the world had a very narrow slot designated for them and expected them to file themselves into it and stop taking up irregular space. On the first day of the pilot cohort orientation, she stood in front of 9 people in a conference room that was the least impressive space in the hospital. Beige walls, conference table too big for the room, a projector that worked if you hit the top left corner. And she looked at them and thought about what to say. She'd written 3 versions of an opening address. She'd thrown all of them out the night before. I was a combat medic for 11 years, she said. When I left service, I became a floor nurse at this hospital. I was told several times by several people, in several different ways, that I should know my lane and stay in it. She paused. The reason this program exists is because one morning the building needed something more than lane staying, and I was here, and what I'd been told was irrelevant turned out to be the only thing that mattered. She looked at the 9 people in the room. Some of them were looking at her the way you looked at someone when you were trying to decide how much of what they were saying to believe. That was a reasonable thing to do, and she respected it. I'm not going to tell you that who you were before translates perfectly into who you're becoming, she said. It doesn't. There are things you'll have to learn and things you'll have to unlearn, and some of those will be harder than any of the other things you've done. But I'm going to tell you that what you already carry is real, and it has value. And the purpose of this program is to make sure you don't have to spend years convincing someone else of that before you get to do the work. Danny Voss, sitting at the far end of the table, had his arms crossed and the expression of someone who was reserving judgment at a level that was almost admirable. He said, "Is this the part where you tell us we're here because we're special?" "No," she said. "You're here because you're trained and you have something worth developing, and we have an obligation to do that development correctly, instead of making you start over from zero every time you walk into a room where no one knows your background." She looked at him steadily. "Whether that makes you special is your business, not mine." He uncrossed his arms. Not a lot. A few degrees. It was enough. 8 months after the incident, on a Tuesday morning in late spring when the air off Caldwell Bay had gone warm and the hospital windows caught the light at an angle that turned the corridor golden for about 20 minutes before the sun moved, Avery was walking to the room of a patient she still saw once a week, Mrs. Delphine Okafor, who had been discharged after her hip replacement and had returned 3 months later with a separate issue and was recovering in a room 2 floors up from where she'd started, which she had commented on with the wry precision of someone who felt the universe was making a specific point. She stopped in the hallway outside Mrs. Okafor's room because Agent Yunt was standing there, in civilian clothing this time, with a folder under her arm and the expression of someone who had something to say and had been deciding how to say it. "The sentencing finished yesterday," Yunt said. "Aldrin. And the state comptroller's director. And the regulatory administrator." Avery waited. "Aldrin got 22 years. Yunt paused. "The other 2 took plea agreements, 8 and 11 years respectively. All assets connected to the distribution network have been frozen pending civil forfeiture." She paused again. "The network is functionally dismantled. It'll take time for the remaining infrastructure to collapse. These things don't end on a single day, but the core of it is gone." Avery leaned against the corridor wall. The golden light was doing its 20-minute thing at the end of the hall, and the people it was distributing to, the communities. Yunt nodded slowly. "That part is harder. The supply side collapses faster than the demand side recovers. There are programs." She paused. "There are always programs. Whether they're sufficient is a different question. It's the honest question." "Yes." Yunt looked at her. "I wanted to tell you in person. It felt like the right way to close it." Avery thought about the word close, what it meant and what it didn't mean, what ended and what just changed shape. The network was dismantled. The evidence was preserved. The names were on record. 11 people were going to trial or had already been sentenced. Nadia Obi was back on duty. Danielle Webb was in school. Dennis Farrow was consulting, under an agreement that had generated its own controversy, with a federal oversight body that was trying to do preventively what he'd spent 18 months doing retrospectively. Marcus Webb was finishing his residency in a hospital 3 hours north and had texted her once to say that he was okay, which she'd read twice and decided was exactly as much communication as the situation required. None of it was closed. That wasn't how things worked, but it was accounted for, which was the version of closure that was actually available, and she'd decided a long time ago to stop waiting for the version that wasn't. "Thank you," she said to Yunt, "for coming." Yunt nodded once, the way that meant something without being elaborate, and left. Avery straightened up from the wall and went through the door into Mrs. Okafor's room. The old woman was sitting up with her reading glasses on and a paperback open on her lap, and the television on with the sound muted, which she did because she liked the visual company without the noise. She looked up when Avery came in. "You look better than last time," Mrs. Okafor said. "I'm sleeping more." "Good. You needed it." She watched Avery check the IV line and glance at the monitor readings. "How's your program?" "Growing." She adjusted the drip rate slightly. The line had a slow partial kink from the position Mrs. Okafor had been resting in. Second cohort starts in 3 months. We have 17 applicants. From the first 9? We expanded the intake criteria. She smoothed the tubing and stepped back. One of the first cohort finished her trauma certification last month. She's taking an ER position in Raleigh. Mrs. Okafor smiled. It was the broad, specific smile of someone who had spent 63 years recognizing when something that should have happened was finally happening. "And you," she said. "How are you?" The question landed the way Mrs. Okafor's questions always landed, directly, without decoration, expecting an honest answer rather than a professional one. Avery looked at her for a moment. She thought about a stairwell in October and the ambient light and a compression wrap that was slightly too tight. She thought about a radio frequency she shouldn't have been able to hear. She thought about 2 hands doing the same work for the first time in a long time, and about a program named Bridge because names were hard, and that one was accurate, and about 9 people sitting in a beige conference room deciding whether to trust her, and about a 26-year-old Marine Corpsman who had uncrossed his arms by 3 degrees, and somehow that had felt like the beginning of something. She thought about 15 months of trying to be quiet and what she'd discovered, that quiet was not the same as peace, and peace was not the same as stillness, and what she'd actually needed was not to stop but to find a direction that was worth the motion. "I'm good," she said. "Mrs." Okafor looked at her over the reading glasses with the expression of someone conducting an assessment. She was more qualified to perform than most. "That's not what you say when you're managing a situation." "No," Avery said. "It's not." Mrs. Okafor nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her book. Avery checked the call button, noted the monitor readings, straightened the chart, and walked back out into the hallway, where the golden light was almost done with its 20 minutes, and the corridor was returning to its ordinary bright daytime self, and the building around her was full of people doing difficult work with incomplete information and imperfect equipment, and the particular stubborn commitment that was the actual substance of care when you stripped away everything else. She walked toward it, not because she had finally figured out who she was, not because the 2 things she'd spent 15 months treating as opposites had resolved into something clean, but because the work was in front of her, and she was the person trained to do it, and she had stopped waiting for better conditions in which to begin. The woman they had looked through, in corridors, in handoffs, in morning rounds where her name was said like a placeholder, had not changed into someone they couldn't ignore. She had always been that person. She had simply stopped making it easy for the world to pretend otherwise. And it turned out that was enough. It had always been enough. The only thing that had ever needed to change was the decision to stop standing quietly in a lane that someone else had assigned her and to walk, without apology, into the full width of what she actually was.